Ralph, thanks so much for joining us and for your willingness to be our first person today.
Thank you.
Ralph, you have so much to share with us, and we have a short period, so we'll just get right to it if that's okay with you.
Sure.
Ralph, your parents met in 1933, the year that Hitler took power in Germany, and they moved to Holland in 1936 before you were born. Before you talk about your parents' move to Holland and their life with you during the war and the Holocaust, tell us what you can about their early lives and the events that caused them to move to Holland.
My father had some very difficult experiences in the 1930s in Germany, in Krefeld. He got beaten up several times for being Jewish. They put swastika stickers on his father's store in downtown Krefeld. He felt like he was being persecuted. His method of survival was basically he made friends with the person he thought was the strongest person in his community, and that person ended up defending him so he would stop getting beaten up. He did, before he decided to leave Germany, he was accused of raping a young woman who worked in the same store as he did. He was put on trial, and during the trial, when they asked the young lady to come to the witness stand, she said, "I can't go through with this, it didn't happen." So the young lady was put in prison, although she got out from what we've heard right afterwards. But my father was released, and he said, I came so close to not being able to survive, I have to leave. So he decided to find a way to get out of Germany, and he only got as far as the Netherlands. He wanted to come to the United States, but the borders were closed for Jews, and so that was not possible.
But before going to Holland, he had tried to come to the U.S.?
Yes, he had.
And just could not get the visas?
He couldn't get the visas, yes.
Tell us a little bit about your grandparents. And your father, I think, at one point worked for your grandparents in one of their stores. Tell us about that.
My grandfather had a very large department store in downtown Krefeld. In fact, he owned the whole city block. There were all stores all the way around, offices on the second and third floor, and then residences on the fourth and fifth floor. So he was quite well off. My father worked in the materials department in his store. He had gone to a technical school to learn about fabrics. And this is where he met the young woman that supposedly accused him, although he didn't even know why he was arrested at the time that happened. So he was working in the store, and I guess he had, in his mind, he had formulated a plan as to how to get out of Germany. It was not possible to bring your assets from Germany to another country. That was forbidden. So my father, who was, I would say, a somewhat paranoid personality, he spent a lot of time trying to figure out how to do things differently than everybody else. So he converted most of his assets into diamonds, silk, and gold. And he managed to smuggle all of them out of the country in different ways by putting them in different parts of the car. He put the gold in his tires, he put the diamonds in his radiator, and he put the silk to the fabric that provided the cushions under the upholstery in the car. And he went across the border several times in order to do this. Everybody thought he was sort of crazy, which he probably was to some degree, but he did manage to. Everyone in our family survived. My parents, my sister, I did, and both sets of grandparents. And that was true of only 2% of the Jews in the Netherlands. So we were pretty fortunate, as you'll hear later, in terms of being able to escape the Nazis.
Ralph, with your father being adamant that he needed to leave Germany and making the kinds of plans you've described, your grandparents were less eager to go. Is that right?
Yes, my both grandfathers served in World War I. They were decorated as German soldiers, worthy of the honor. and they thought nothing could happen to them because they were war heroes, and especially my father's father was very wealthy, well known in the community, involved in civic programs, and he didn't think there was any reason for him to leave. My parents did go back and forth to Germany, and they happened to be in Germany in 1938 when the Kristallnacht. And that was so dangerous, they thought, and even they convinced my grandparents at that time to come with them to the Netherlands, because before that, my grandparents did not want to leave Germany. They didn't see any reason for them to leave Germany, and they thought they were relatively safe there. But after Kristallnacht, they decided that this was now the time for them to move.
Ralph, for the benefit of our audience, just a word about Kristallnacht, or the Night of Broken Glass, in November of 1938, all over Germany and Austria as well. There were assaults on German businesses. Businesses were ransacked. Hundreds of synagogues were burned. Many Jewish men were beaten up, and thousands were arrested. So that was indeed a night of terror.
That was really, yes, that was a night of terror. And like every other business, my grandfather's store was significantly damaged, and it was a message, they thought, that said, you're not wanted here, get out, which is what they did.
Ralph, you mentioned your father clandestinely, illegally hiding the goods that he had converted, the gold, the diamonds, as well as the silk, and going back and forth a number of times. You shared with me on, I think, his last trip when he took a friend with him.
Right.
Will you tell us about that?
So my father, who always he was always a challenger. He never liked to do things the way everybody else did. He thought the rules applied to everyone else. They didn't really apply to him. And he had been very fortunate in crossing the border half a dozen times and never getting caught. On this last trip, he told his friend that he was not to smuggle anything with him because this was a great risk, and my mother was also in the car. This story is slightly different than what I told Bill, because I was reading my father's memoirs, and he described it differently than I had remembered the incident. But anyway, my father said, so they were going across the border, and in this instance, the Germans knew people were hiding things in their cars. And so they checked everything. They checked the upholstery, they checked the tires, they checked the radiator. And my father, that time, hadn't hidden anything. And they checked his luggage. And so finally, they let them go. And when they let them go, the friend sitting next to him said, "Oh, I'm so relieved." He said, "I put some money in my toiletry kit, and I'm glad they didn't discover it." My father said, "You did what?" He said, "I told you not to bring anything." "Well, I had to," and he only brought a couple of 100 German marks. And my father said, "For that, you risk our lives?" But anyway, that's what happened, but they didn't get caught. So he was very fortunate.
Ralph, during that time, were there other family members, extended family members, or family friends that also left your city or left Germany and came to Holland with you?
They didn't come with us, but my father had several friends who were involved in the same business. And when he came to the Netherlands, he rented a store in downtown Amersfoort with another man named Lange, and they set up a store in Amersfoort. There was another friend with whom he set up a store in Amsterdam, and there was a third friend who set up a store in a city called Tilburg. So yes, he and the stores were doing quite well before the German invasion. And my father felt relatively secure, but my father also thought, Holland is not, they don't have a strong army. They can't really stand up to the Germans. And when the Germans come, we have to do something.
Before we turn to that, in 1937, your sister Marion was born. And as you'd explained to me, their life was pretty comfortable for several years. You were born in late 1939, after your parents had been in Holland for 3 years at that point. And then more than 2 years later, in the spring of 1949, your family went into hiding.
1941,
41, and
not 49.
tell us what you can about the time between your birth and then the family going into hiding, including the incredible preparations that were made about going into hiding. Tell us about that time.
So my father, he wanted to get a place which wasn't as easy to discover as living in a house in the city. And so he had contracted a friend who knew somebody else, and they agreed allow him to create a cottage in the middle of a set of fields. There were no roads or anything, so that if it was necessary to get away, that he could have a place for us to stay. And he went there on weekends. He drove up after the cottage was built. He used to drive up on weekends and put canned goods in the cottage, so if we ended up there, we'd at least have some food to eat. And when that finally happened at the end of 1941, we had to leave because it was getting very dangerous. We had become a part of a Jewish synagogue, which my mother really, she was very frightened. After the war, she never wanted to admit that we were Jewish. She didn't want to be a part of any Jewish community, and she felt that we were being pursued because we were on a list, and she never wanted to be on another list. Anyway, they knew where we lived in Amersfoort, and it was very dangerous to stay in that community because we knew that Jewish people were being rounded up and put on trains, even though some of them actually volunteered. My father knew from listening to the radio reports from London, as well as some underground information, that there were concentration camps and that people from Holland were being sent on the trains to concentration camps, even though it said, that this was a way to freedom, and that if they worked for the Germans, then they would not necessarily be executed. He thought that this was propaganda, which was to the greatest extent. So when things got too dangerous, we finally, our family, my mother and father and 2 children, we moved into this little cottage. And initially, it was really not bad living there.
Ralph, let me interrupt for just a second.
Yes.
You shared with me that once the decision was made that we need to move there, as you're getting ready to go there, your father sat down and had a sort of a heart-to-heart talk with all of you.
Yeah, there were 2 issues, actually, that I didn't mention then. Okay, the heart-to-heart talk was we ended up getting false papers from the Dutch underground. And this created a big problem, especially for my sister. We were all renamed. So my name was Ralph. I became Wimpy, which is a diminutive in Dutch for the name Willem, which is the name that my father took, equivalent to William. My sister was named Marion, but she was called Marijtje. We picked more traditional Dutch names, and my sister just insisted, no, she wasn't Marijtje, she was Marion. And my father said, well, from now on, as long as the Germans are here, you're going to be Marijtje. And she said, no, how can I be somebody that I'm not? Anyway, my father got so frustrated that it was the first time he slapped her. And he just kept insisting, you have to remember this, because that's what's on these papers, and that's how we're going to survive. So that was a very significant incident. I think I was too young to really understand the difference. My father also, very smartly, he had a fairly nice car, which he disassembled during this period by putting the wheels in one place, by putting the chassis someplace else, and the engine in the third place, so that none of it in and of itself would be of any value. But after the war, he was one of the few survivors who could put his car back together and had a mode of transportation.
So he went and found where all the pieces were hidden? That's pretty amazing. That really is. So you moved to the cottage. Eventually, or maybe right away, your grandparents also came. And so there's a large group of you in what I believe was a very small place.
It was a very small cottage. It just had 2 bedrooms. It had 2 side rooms plus a living room. And yes, my grandparents stayed with us. It was relatively comfortable, and we felt fairly secure. Nobody knew where we were. We didn't associate with anybody else. And for 8 months, that worked out very well. I think it was 10 months it was. And then one night...
Before you, a little bit more about life in there. Small, no heating, no plumbing, no running water. So very, very primitive in that way.
Yes.
And what about food? What did you do to eat during that time?
Well, there are two sources. One, we had the
Canned
goods that my parents had taken to the cottage. And on several occasions, through the Dutch underground, we got some coupons to get food. And my mother and I would go out on the bicycle. My mother had a bicycle, and I used to sit behind her, hanging onto her waist. And she would come back with some fresh food, which was very unusual, instead of eating some canned goods, which we did during most of the war. It was a little frightening to go into the cities to get the food. And on 2 occasions, once while we were in the cottage, and once when we were in the chicken coop at the end of the war, we were stopped by the Dutch police. And the Dutch police, unfortunately, were in cahoots with the Germans. Many of them, voluntarily participated in identifying Jews and in going to capture them. So one night, after 10 months in this cottage, that one of the farmer's sons came running to the cottage, banging on the door and saying, "You got to get out, you got to get out, the Germans are coming." And so all of us got out, and we ran as far as we could, and we saw the Germans, we heard them. They came into the cottage, they said, "Somebody's been living here." Well, that was pretty obvious. And they, luckily, that was a night of a horrible storm, and thunder and lightning, and the Germans didn't look very far. They just didn't find us, and instead they burned the cottage down. And so that was the end of our sanctuary. We couldn't go back there. But the next morning, and this is, that night, that's my first real memory of the war, was that night when the Germans came. I remember how, the storm, how noisy it was, how wet I got. I heard the Germans screaming and yelling. I saw the cottage go up in flames. And then the next morning, this is the second incident I remember, as we're walking to thank the farmer for the warning that his son had given us, we see somebody hanging from the barn with a meat hook in his chin. And we found out later on that was the farmer's oldest son who had betrayed us to the Nazis. And the father and the other 2 sons had hung him for... Anyway, that's just, this image of seeing this man hanging there with blood dripping down was that's the second image that I had. And those are 2 things that, I've never been able to get over.
Yeah, you said that image particularly haunted you for many years.
Yes, it did.
Ralph, if you don't mind, I'm going to set your mic. It is pulling away from you, so let me just take care of that. There we go.
Thank you.
So after being forced under those circumstances to leave the cottage, your family would end up finding refuge in a number of different places, including eventually ending up in the chicken coop. Tell us about the other places that you went before you ended up in the chicken coop, both where you went as well as your parents and grandparents.
Okay, so it was very difficult for the German underground to find hiding places. There were 8 of us, and certainly they couldn't find any place that could accommodate all 8. So they provided different hiding places for different members of the family. And initially, my sister and I ended up on the 3rd floor above a bakery and ice cream shop. That was on the 1st floor, and the 2nd floor is where the family lived. And then on the 3rd floor is where my sister and I stayed. There's a wonderful thing that happened last summer where as a result of this family, they had 7 children, and they took 2 of us in. And I met one of the surviving sons. right here at the Holocaust Museum. His grandson was working on a project about the Holocaust and wanted to find the Jewish family that his family had rescued. He had never been able to discover that. He wasn't very good at using computers. And so his grandson, who lives in Ontario, Canada, he did this research. This was his second year of a project, and he found me, which wasn't really so difficult, because I had done a tape for the Spielberg Foundation, and there's a segment of that tape that is distributed by the Midwest Center for Holocaust Studies in Kansas City, where I lived for 35 years. And so he found this, it's a 30-minute portrait of the interview that they did. And so he called me and he said who he was, last name Van Roon. I said, yes, the name is familiar, but I really don't have any specific memory. He said, well, my grandfather remembers that you came and your sister came to their house and spent some time there, and that he would like to talk to you, if that's okay. I said, I'd love to talk to him. So anyway, we had this lengthy phone conversation, and he seemed like such a nice man. He was a couple of years older than I am, and about 3 months later, he said, my family is coming to Washington, D.C. Would it be okay if we met you? I said, I'd love to meet you, and thank you in person for the sacrifices your family made. Anyway, his daughter contacted the museum about the fact that she was bringing together one of the rescuers and one of the survivors, and would the museum, be interested? And so when they came to visit, they contacted me and said, would you like to be on the news? This Mr. Van Roon is going to be there, and we'd like to record your meeting. And so that was just a very emotional experience, and we've been in contact ever since. I hope that we will meet him again. My wife and I have talked about maybe going up to Ontario and meeting them there. And since that happened, I talked to my brother-in-law, who was also a Holocaust survivor in the Netherlands, who stayed on the farm with his brother. And he contacted the family, got in touch with the family, the third generation, and ironically, those kids were also in Ontario. And so they're going to try to get together with them as well.
And Ralph, of course, their home, you had to eventually leave there, and under quite dramatic circumstances.
Yes, so we were there for not quite a month. The mother told her children, we have some guests in the house. It is important you don't tell anybody that we have guests. Don't tell anybody that there are people living there, and nothing will happen.
Well, and one clarifying point. Your mother was able to come and visit you, and that's why she happened in this story. Yep.
Yeah, she could visit us a couple of times a week. And in this story, one of the kids, I guess, told one of his friends that there were people living in his attic. And so one day the police came to check this out. And we had a method where the family had a broom handle, and they would hit the ceiling 3 times, and that was a warning that we had to hide. And so there was a place in the rafters above this 3rd floor where we could go and try to hide. Although if somebody came up after us, they would certainly be able to find us. Anyway, on this particular occasion, they banged on the ceiling. We had gone through this exercise a dozen times. My mother that particular day was visiting us. She could come during the day, but she couldn't stay overnight. She was in a different hiding place. My father was someplace else as well. And so we heard them come upstairs, and for the first time when we went through this exercise, we actually took the ladder with us. I mean, usually we just crawled up, and my sister and I wouldn't have been able to pull the ladder up anyway, but my mother was with us, and we pulled the ladder up and hid it in between the rafters as well. So there wasn't a good way for them to find where we were. Anyway, they said, we know that there's somebody here. The evidence is right here. Where are they? And nobody said anything. And all of a sudden, they saw this yellow streak coming down the wall. And they said, well, they're upstairs. And so they moved a piece of furniture. One of them stood on top of the furniture and couldn't quite see anything. And my sister had gotten attached to a cat. And the cat came jumping right on this man's face. And he said, oh, that explains where the urine came from, and they left. Well, that was, it was then too dangerous for us to remain in that attic, and so we had to find other hiding places.
And so where did you go next?
Okay, well, I remember that night. In fact, there's a part of that story. Okay, when I was about 35 years old, I saw a movie. I don't remember the title of the movie, but for like 5 nights in a row, I had the same dream, and I couldn't understand what that dream signified. So I had a dream where I was little, and somebody had their hands on my throat and across my mouth. And I was squashed. I was squished in a place, and I couldn't identify what that was or how that occurred. And so I asked my mother. I called her. She was living in California at the time. And I said, I've been having this dream. And I described it, and she says to me, you can't remember that. I said, well, I haven't remembered it. I'm 35 years old now, and I finally do remember it, and it's haunting me. What happened? And so she explained that night when we were up in the attic, she was holding my throat and covering my mouth to make sure that I didn't make any sounds so that the Germans wouldn't catch us. But she was so scared, it wasn't the cat that peed, she's the one that peed. Anyway, so that was, that sort of answered the mystery. It's interesting that, after I told my mother and she gave me the explanation, I didn't have the dream anymore. And I don't remember very many dreams in my life, but that one certainly stuck for quite a while. So after we had to leave the attic, we went to several other places. None of them turned out to be very fortunate. In one place, we were at a butcher shop with my parents, and the butcher my mother is a very attractive-looking woman. She was also very despondent as a result of what was going on during the war. She was sure she wasn't really going to survive. This butcher was making approaches to her, and one day he got her in his bedroom and started to undress her, and then his wife observed this and was screaming and yelling and said, they got to get out immediately, they have to leave. And my mother, she talked about it afterwards. She said, well, what was the point of resisting? I'm going to die anyway, and if this was going to keep us safe, well, that was worth doing. So we had to find another hiding place. And the last one, we were in this really fancy house with this couple that had no children. There must have been, 6, 7 bedrooms. She had lived in Indonesia for quite a number of years. And she approached my parents by saying, I'll take care of your kids. I'll watch out for them during the war, but you have to make a promise that those kids are going to belong to me. They're not going to be your children anymore. They're going to be my children. I will adopt them, and after the war, you can't search for them. This created another huge controversy between my father and my sister, because my sister thought my father made the wrong choice. He said, no, you can't do that. There are our children. We want them to survive, but we can't give them up. In case we survive, we want to make sure that we can see them after the war is over.
And if I remember right, you shared with me that she was also a pretty wealthy woman with a large estate and a palatial home. And,
right.
Yeah.
My sister thought that was a much better option. We were much more likely, we were much more likely to survive living in that house with her than we were to be with my parents. But my father insisted that, if he was going to die, we were all going to die. And even, before my parents died, when my father was in his late 90s, they still had this argument about whether or not that was the right choice. And my father basically said, it was obviously the right choice. You're alive. Yeah.
Right. Ralph, before you turn to telling us about the last place you were hidden, in each of the places you've described, do you know where your grandparents were during that time?
My parents knew where they were through the Dutch underground, but no, I did not know. Actually, my grandfather taught me a wonderful skill. One of the things that we used to eat during that period during the war was mushrooms. My grandfather had studied which mushrooms were edible, which ones were not, where you find them, how you pick them. And so he used to take me with him when we looked in the fields and got these mushrooms. And I've been an aficionado of mushrooms ever since. They were sort of one of the staples that allowed us to survive during the war. Mm-hmm. So after we left this very wealthy family, after they weren't able to adopt us, they didn't want to take care of us any longer. And so we had to leave that house as well. And so the German underground found this farm for us in a not very safe place, really. Arnhem is right near the German border. And we didn't know at the time, but there was a German encampment less than 2 miles away. And so during this period when we were stuck in the chicken coop, and we were in the chicken coop the same day as the chickens left. It was just horrible. For years I remember the horrible smell that was in this place.
You said to me it was the worst place of all that you were hidden.
Oh, yes,
yeah.
It was by far the worst place.
Yep.
It was not, and it wasn't very safe there because there were bombers going overhead all the time. There were V2s that were dropping. I saw bodies in the field. It was just very frightening to be there. But this was a place where we stayed for the rest of the war for 13 months.
Describe for us. We can imagine what a chicken coop looks like, having seen them. But what was life like for such a long period of time living in this chicken coop?
It was horrible. It was just, we just had wooden planks. My mother was a very clean person. She hated, even specks of dirt. And here there was all the, chicken droppings all over, and the odor you couldn't get rid of. We didn't really have a window. We just had an opening in one of the walls with some screening, but not the kinds of screens you have here, but that you would, with big holes in them. And it was, it had a roof on it. I guess it had 4 walls. There was probably enough floor space for 6 people to sleep. At the end of the war, there were 13 of us that were sleeping there. We slept in, 6 people got to sleep, and then 6 more people got to sleep.
And this included your four grandparents.
Grandparents were there, and some cousins were there at the end of the war. People were having trouble finding hiding places, and so we just kept adding people. One of the nights that we were there, something came flying in through the window. We didn't discover till the next morning that was a hand grenade. It didn't go off. So there's 3 instances. I don't know, luck, fate. There were certainly instances where we were, very lucky to survive.
Ralph, what was your food situation like in the chicken coop for all that period?
Food. Well, we didn't have any canned food in the chicken coop. Right. We didn't have any preparations really. The farmer allowed us to go through. They had pigs on the farm that ate almost everything, but they used to, after dinner, they grew cabbage. We were not allowed to take any of the crops that they were growing. Cabbage and potatoes were 2 of the staples. And the farmer, allowed us to take the scraps that he threw out. So we were allowed to go through his garbage before they took the rest of it to the pigsties. And so we ate potato peels and the outer leaves of white cabbage.
This was over the course of over a year.
This is
Course of over a year.
We still went out. My mother did go out and, try to visit the Dutch underground when she could to get some food, to get some clothing. But most of the time, that's what we ate. We ate the mushrooms that we found. We ate cabbage leaves and potato peels.
Given the conditions that you've described, the food situation, health concerns must have been a real concern. What did that mean for you?
It was very bad. We had real problems staying healthy. Both my sister and I had to be hospitalized during the time that we were in the chicken coop. My mother took chances and took us on the back of the bicycles to a Dutch hospital that very fortunately accepted our papers and took care of our digestive problems. We also had, even after the war, I had it's called scabies, which were as a result, I guess, of the germs and the mites that were in the chicken coop. I also had worms. So I would have been skinny anyway, but the worms ate a lot of the food that I digested. And my mother used to try to catch them before I went to sleep at night. They were and they would stick around your anus, and she'd pull them out, but she never caught all of them. And so after the war, I had to be hospitalized to take care of the diseases. My sister had problems. She had trouble going to the bathroom. She held everything in during the time that we were in hiding, but it became more serious after the war, and so she had to be operated on. And the doctors suggested, this was after the war, that she find some place where it wasn't so tense, there wasn't so much anxiety. And so my parents sent her to some relatives that they had in Switzerland, and she stayed there for a couple of weeks before we were able to pick her up, and she was much better when that happened.
And Ralph, while you're dealing with all that, at this stage of the war, the Allies are bombing constantly, so bombs are falling all around. The farmer had, I think you shared with me, a little sort of primitive bomb shelter.
Yes, he did. And I don't really remember how many people, the farmer employed and how many kids he had, but he had this metal container that was just slightly underground. And when we'd hear the bombs going off and flying overhead, the farmer used to hide in this shelter, and he allowed us to come in there with them. And so we used to run over there, and I just remember it was like being in a sardine can. It was so hot. We were totally squashed. I had trouble breathing. When they closed the top, it was pitch dark. It was like, being buried alive. And we never really knew, at which point could we get out, and, would somebody be there waiting for us? So this was supposed to help us survive, but really it was, at least from what I remember, it was really, it was like a nightmare that was repeated several times, because there were so many instances where we heard all this noise and where the planes were going overhead and where, the bombs were going off. And so were we safer there? I guess. They didn't bomb the chicken coop, but they didn't bomb the shelter either. So here we are.
So Ralph, here we are at the very end of the war in April and May of 1945. Tell us about the visit you had from some German soldiers.
Yeah, so two things at the end of the war. About, I guess, 2 days before we were liberated, two German soldiers came to the chicken coop and started talking to my parents. And basically what they said was, our encampment is just down the way. We knew that you guys were here. We didn't say anything. If we're being put on trial after the war, would you speak in our favor? Because we protected you. We made sure that nothing happened. And afterwards, the next day, they came back, and my parents were from Germany. There was no hiding their accent. And so the Germans felt free to talk to them in German, and they discovered that my parents liked to play bridge. So they came over to play bridge, which And my parents, for the first time, they said, I want you kids to make as much noise as you can because, we don't want to play bridge.
After being totally silent for years.
Silent for years, right. And anyway, I know I didn't make any noise. It was just, not in my nature to do that. But the Germans spent a couple of hours playing bridge with my parents, and the next day, the Canadian soldiers came to liberate us. And they knew we were there because one of the hospitals that my parents took us to was from the Canadian soldiers. They were stationed not too far away, and they had a hospital for the injured soldiers, and they took care of us a couple of times.
So after liberation, you're liberated. How quickly were your parents able to try to attempt to resume a normal life?
Well, they tried immediately. I guess I wanted to say one thing about the Canadian soldiers. Two things. They came marching in, and there was this music, and it was like a parade, and they came right by the chicken coop because they knew we were there. And they came with Hershey's chocolate and chewing gum. I thought the chocolate was the greatest thing in the world. I never tasted anything like that. And the chiclets, I chewed them and I swallowed them, not knowing that was not what you're supposed to do. But anyway, the chocolate became, my favorite thing to eat for years. In fact, I still love chocolate. After the war, after we were liberated, my parents really tried to resume a normal life. But initially, they owned a house, but the house that they came back to was then occupied by two former German soldiers who claimed they had legal title to the property. Which, they had a deed indicating that was the case. Of course, it was a deed made by the Germans for other Germans, and my father had to fight and go to court to get them evicted, which he ultimately did.
But it took a while to get that done.
Yes. It took 2.5 months before we could move back into the house.
And then was he able to get his business back?
He got his business back, yeah. There were other people that had been running the business, and by the time he came back to the store, everything was empty. These people were selling the goods that my father had acquired, but by the end of the war, there was nothing left, so he had to basically start all over again. But they tried to resume a normal life. I think my sister and I felt abandoned. After the war, we barely saw our parents for a couple of years. They were always out. They were out socializing, they were out with friends, they were out to sort of rebuild lives that had really been shattered.
You shared with me, I was struck by that. You said that your parents felt thoroughly liberated and that they were trying to regain the years they lost in some way.
Right. Well, that's the feeling that I had. I think this is certainly what my mother wanted to do. My father was always interested in making a lot of money. That was, his life's goal. He was a millionaire 3 times, and he was bankrupt 3 times in his life. So he succeeded and he failed. Partly he always failed because, he had great ideas, but he could never really do the minutiae. Like in one instance, he had a factory where he built shower stall installations, these plastic things that and he was one of the first ones in Europe to create this. And they had a fire one day, and the factory was basically put out of commission, but he had discovered afterwards he'd forgotten to pay his insurance bill. And so he wasn't covered. The good part of that was that he didn't have to pay taxes for the next 15 years because he had such a huge loss, and you can deduct the losses from your gains. And that's sort of the kind of life that they led.
And Ralph, your parents wanted to leave the Netherlands, come to the United States. It took till 1951 for you to actually make the move here, although you did come here for a year, but weren't able to stay. Say a little bit about that.
Well, my parents wanted to come to the United States, not as visitors, but as permanent residents. In order to do that, they needed to get an affidavit from an American family willing to support them. I guess it took a significant amount of money to bring over 4 people, and before we came to visit, there was nobody that was willing to do that. Even though my parents had a lot of money, and so what we discovered when we came in 1948, and for me it was a horrible experience. During that time I learned how to speak English, but I was also extremely shy, and in the first 6 months we were here, I went to 6 different schools. Obviously I didn't fit in any place. And I went to 6 different schools because my parents stayed wherever there was some vacant space that they knew about. So we didn't have really a permanent residence at all. They finally hooked up with some cousins who were willing to provide an affidavit if my parents left $50,000 in the bank account here, which they did. And as a result, we were able to apply for permanent residency when we finally came back in 1951.
And Ralph, in the little time we have left, and we want to leave a little time, if we can, for some questions from our audience, but you shared with me, I had mentioned earlier that you ended up playing baseball for the high school baseball team. You had said to me that it was that you became a real American. Will you say a little bit about that?
Well, I don't know if you hear an accent, but I spent a lot of time trying to get rid of my accent. I didn't want to be Jewish. I didn't want to be a foreigner. I didn't want to be an outcast. I wanted to be where I was, which was in America. I wanted to be an American. My parents, they couldn't do that. I mean, they had very strong accents. They still lived like Europeans. They had European values. They had European tastes. But I dressed like an American. I got a crew cut, which they thought was just horrible, and they thought I was like an alien. I didn't belong in this family, but that was really the only way that I felt that I could survive. And luckily, when I came to this town, this was in the fall of 1951. The first sport that kids played was soccer, and that was the only sport that I'd ever played in the Netherlands. And so I played soccer, and they thought, boy, this guy is a really good athlete. Because in Holland, that was the only sport, really. And so I did very well in soccer. So then when we played baseball the next spring, they picked me like as the second person on the team. I'd never played baseball in my life, and I was so embarrassed that I couldn't do this. So I spent months throwing the ball, hitting the ball, and I ultimately made the baseball team.
Well, you clearly had natural talent to do that.
Yeah.
Ralph, if you don't mind, why don't we just see if we have a few questions from our audience in the little time we have left. I'm going to ask if you will stay with us through the questioning period, because we're going to hear again from Ralph to close the program. We have microphones in each of the aisles, the 2 aisles. We ask if you have a question to please go to the microphone, use it, make your question as brief as you can. I'll repeat it just to be sure we hear it, and then Ralph will respond to your question. So do we have anybody willing to go up to the microphone? Okay, here we go.
Thank you for your story. Did you ever connect with the farmer or the farmer's family?
Question is, did you ever connect with the farmer's family?
After the war, yes. My parents really were very good about that. My parents believed in helping people, which I believe in also. That's one of the things that I think you'll learn from this kind of experience. These people, took the risk of hiding us in many instances, not even knowing who we were. My parents after the war made sure that they gave whatever they could to the 2 families that were primarily responsible for our survival. They helped put their kids through college. They provided opportunities for them to travel, and so it was very important for them to make sure that these people were rewarded for what they did.
I'll go here, okay.
We have a question from Facebook from Maria.
The question from Facebook, okay.
She wants to know, what's the one thing you held on to for hope? And also, Catherine hopes that you have a book. Because she would like to buy it.
That what?
Yeah.
Catherine hopes you have a book. She wants to buy it.
Oh.
Okay.
I've been working on a book, and unfortunately, it's not really finished. But I'm glad somebody is interested. What is the thing I hang on to for hope? I think I hang on to for hope from the fact that there are people in the world who are willing to do the right thing, even when the odds are really against them, when it's really dangerous to do that. And we found, enough people. In fact, after the war, I thought the Dutch people were wonderful. I thought, they all made great sacrifices and protected us. Well, I found out, later on, in fact, I've taught some classes on the Holocaust, that the Dutch were really pretty terrible. That after Poland, it was the worst country to be in. Over 80% of the Dutch Jews did not survive. And a lot of Dutch people, they worked along with the Dutch police to, reveal where the Jews were hiding. So, we were lucky, but everybody, all the Jews in Holland weren't lucky. But, we were, I guess the hope is that there are people like that and that you can find them, which we did.
Yeah. We're going to have time for 2 more questions, I think. But I'm going to...
I'm just curious about after the war.
I'm sorry, start over again?
Well, I'm curious about after the war. Weren't many or most of your parents' friends dead?
Were their friends dead?
Did you lose most of your family or friends?
Well, a lot of the people in our family, when they're, I looked through some of the books that provided by Yad Vashem, listing all the names. There are lots of relatives and friends who died, but there were also, surprisingly, quite a few friends of my parents that survived. Ironically, my parents ended up living in Laguna Hills in a retirement community in California, and there were 6 other friends of my mother that went to kindergarten with her that live in the same place.
Wow.
None of them knew that the others were there.
Wow, okay. I'm going to come over here. I know we won't have time for your question, but I'm going to invite you up afterwards to ask the question. Okay.
Did you become particularly close with any family member or your sister, or make any friends when moving from place to place?
Were you able to make friends when you were there?
And did you get particularly close with your sister or your parents or a certain family member?
Yes, my sister was really sort of the thing I held on to throughout the war. She became my best friend. True after the war, I never got along very well with my father. He was hardly ever there. He certainly wasn't interested in anything I did. He never went to any of the games I played or the plays I was in, or even to the fact that I made the speech at my graduation. He didn't attend. He was always too busy. But my sister was always there and was very supportive, and we had a very close relationship. But in the Netherlands, I made one friend after the war who had this big train set in his attic. But and I also used to ride bicycles with him. But other than that, I didn't feel like I could live in the Netherlands. It was really a place of bad memories and horrible experiences. Although I've been back to visit, my sister lives there. And it's a wonderful country, really. But after the war, that's not how we saw it.
And your sister's coming to visit next week, right?
Coming next week, right.
All right. I want to thank all of you for being here with us today. Remind you that we'll have a first-person program each Wednesday and Thursday until the middle of August. So please come back and join us if you're able to do so. And remember that all of our programs are available on the museum's YouTube page, so you can see them all. When I'm going to turn back to Ralph to close our program in a moment. When he's finished, our photographer Joel is going to come up on the stage, take a photograph of Ralph with you as the background. So please stay for that. And then when Ralph's done, I also will invite anybody who would like to come up on stage and ask a question if you didn't get a chance to do that. Shake his hand, get your photo taken with him. Just the opportunity to meet Ralph. He'll stay here on the stage. It's our tradition at First Person that our first person gets the last word. And so with that, I'm turning it back to Ralph to close today's program.
I never thought it was important as a mark of distinction to be a survivor. I thought, that was a matter of luck or chance, although the museum has convinced me that being a survivor is important because these stories are important. It is necessary, I think, for the world to know what happened and to take that into account to try to prevent that from happening in the future. When I started speaking in the 1970s, I was really hopeful. I thought, the world is changing. Things are getting better. And, there is hope that in the future this won't take place. The history of, the last 15 years or so has gone in the opposite direction. There's genocide all over. There's mistreatments of foreigners, of people of different religions and different skin colors, different backgrounds, and that's most unfortunate. I think what the museum provides is an alternative to that. If you understand what happened and how it happened and how you can do something about it, you only need to help one person, and that person would be able to help one other person. And if it's a stranger, that's even better than if it is somebody that you know. And I think that's what the museum symbolizes and what this whole process is really all about.